Some mornings, the Wyoming sky came down so low and gold over Copper Hollow that a man forgot, for a moment, everything he was riding toward. Nathaniel Coye had learned that lesson slow, the way a person learns most true things, by living through them rather than being told. And on this particular morning, with frost still silvering the fence rails and smoke curling thin from the chimney of a small cabin at the edge of the Kirkland land, he reined in his horse without quite deciding to, same as he had 3 mornings running that week. Addie Kirkland was at the washtub again, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair slipping loose from its pins, as she wrung another family's linens between raw, reddened hands. She did not look up right away. She rarely did anymore. Some caution in her had hardened over the past 8 months into a kind of armor she wore even in the quiet hours, and Nathaniel had come to understand that her silence was not coldness. It was the careful economy of a woman who had already given away more than she could afford to lose. "Morning, Mrs. Kirkland," he said. "Mr. Coye," she kept working the fabric, though he'd learned enough of her rhythms by now to know the pause before she spoke was not indifference. It was armor, checked and rechecked. "I don't suppose you've stopped your horse at my fence 3 mornings this week to talk about frost." He considered lying, decided against it. "No, ma'am, I haven't." She set the linen down at last and looked at him fully, the mountains behind her catching the day's first real light. "I'm a widow," she said, plain as a nail driven straight. The words had the shape of something said many times before, to many men who'd ridden by with the same slow interest in their eyes. A door closing rather than opening. I don't imagine that's the sort of complication a man ought to go looking for. Nathaniel held her gaze a long moment. Somewhere behind him, his horse shifted its weight and blew out a soft breath into the cold air. "Well then," he said finally, "let me offer you something else instead of a complication. Seems a hard thing, watching a woman with hands as capable as yours spend her days washing other folks' shirts, when there might be a better use for them if she was willing to consider it." Neither of them knew, standing there in that thin gold light, how much more urgent the truth about Thomas Kirkland's death was about to become. Addie had married Thomas 6 years before, a rancher's son with the finest grazing land in the territory, and a gentleness that had convinced a modest young woman from Cheyenne she'd found something rare. Those early years had been good ones. The Kirkland spread had grown steadily beneath Thomas's hand, green pasture climbing toward the foothills, fed by a creek that ran clear even in the driest months. Addie had learned ranch life the way she'd once learned embroidery back home, with a patient, surprising competence. She'd learned to read the clouds over the western ridge the way Thomas taught her, which shade of haze meant rain by evening, which meant a dry spell settling in for weeks. She still carried that knowledge every morning, long after the man who'd given it to her was gone. Thomas had died 8 months before that morning at the washtub, found at the bottom of Widow's Notch, 3 miles from the ranch house, his neck broken in a fall the county coroner ruled an accident. A spooked horse, a narrow trail, a man thrown in the one place a man could least afford to be thrown. Copper Hollow had grieved him properly. The little church filled past its walls for the funeral, and then, as towns do, the grief had settled into ordinary memory for everyone, but the woman left holding the heaviest part of it. She had not been allowed to move on so easily. Thomas's older brother, Warren, had spent decades nursing a quiet resentment that their father had left Thomas the better half of the family land, leaving Warren with rockier ground and a smaller share of the creek. Within a month of the funeral, Warren had contested Addie's inheritance, producing an obscure territorial statute claiming that land acquired before a marriage reverted to blood kin rather than a widow, if no children survived to inherit directly. The territorial court, unwilling to rule quickly on unclear precedent, had frozen the estate pending review, leaving Addie with nothing but the small cabin at the property's edge, and whatever coins she could earn honestly while the matter dragged on with no end anyone could name. Nathaniel was 32, and had drifted into Copper Hollow 7 months earlier with enough savings to lease a modest stretch of land at the valley's northern rim. He'd built the beginnings of a small, honest cattle operation with the same unhurried patience he brought to most things. He'd left Kansas 3 years back, after a woman named Josephine had died of fever the winter before their wedding, a loss that had settled into him not as bitterness, but as a kind of quiet recalibration of what mattered. He remembered clearly the first morning he'd crested the pass into this valley, the whole basin spread below him ringed by snow-capped peaks, and had felt, for the first time in 3 restless years, something in his chest settle rather than simply endure. He'd heard Addie's story within his first month in town, delivered second-hand the way such stories always were in a small settlement. The dead husband, the contested land, the proud woman reduced to laundering linens for families who'd once called her their equal. Hearing it, he'd felt an old ache stir in his own chest, recognizing something of his own hard-won understanding that a life could be upended by forces a person never saw coming, no matter how carefully they'd built things beforehand. He'd started riding past her cabin on his way into town, telling himself for the first 2 weeks it was simple neighborly concern. By the 3rd week, watching her work the washtub with that same tired, stubborn dignity morning after morning, he'd stopped pretending it was quite that simple. That evening, riding back toward his own leased parcel with the sky bleeding orange behind the ridgeline, Nathaniel found himself turning over something Addie had said only in passing, so quiet he'd almost missed it beneath the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed dirt. Funny thing, she'd murmured, more to the mountains than to him, how calm that horse was when it came home alone. Wasn't spooked at all, just standing in the pasture waiting on someone to notice. She hadn't said which horse, she hadn't needed to. And somewhere behind that plain, careful sentence, Nathaniel Coye felt the first cold thread of a question take hold in him, one he suspected neither of them was ready yet to pull all the way loose. The question sat with Nathaniel for 2 full days before he found the nerve to ask it plainly. He found her on the 3rd morning not at the washtub, but out by the fence line, mending a gap in the rails with the kind of grim, solitary determination that told him she'd rather be doing almost anything than sitting still with her own thoughts. He dismounted without being asked and picked up the second hammer lying in the grass, and for a while neither of them spoke, the only sound the steady knock of iron against wood and the wind moving low through the frost-browned pasture. "You said something the other morning," he said finally, "about the horse." Addie's hand stilled on the rail. "I say a great many things, Mr. Coye, most of them not worth remembering." "That one was." She set the hammer down slow, deliberate, the way a person sets down something they've been carrying so long they've forgotten the weight of it until the moment they finally let go. "Ranger," she said. "Thomas's horse. Calm as anything, the morning after he didn't come home from checking the line at Widow's Notch. Grazing in the home pasture like nothing at all had happened." She looked out at the mountains, violet-shadowed in the early light. "A horse that spooks bad enough to throw a rider on a trail he's ridden 100 times doesn't usually walk himself home 3 miles later without a mark on him. Seems it'd still be running. Still be spooked. Not standing there peaceful, waiting on someone to notice. You ever say that to the sheriff?" "I said it to myself mostly. That first month, I didn't have the strength to question anything. I was too busy simply surviving each day to interrogate the shape of my own husband's death." She turned to face him fully now, something sharper than grief moving behind her eyes. "And now I've had 8 months to survive. And a horse that walked home too calm still doesn't sit right with me. Whatever the coroner decided." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, turning the thought over the same careful way he judged weather or cattle, looking for the shape of it from every angle before he trusted it. "I know a man," he said finally. "Owen Praxton. Runs a spread 2 valleys over. Was working for your husband right up until a month after the funeral, then left sudden and quiet, the way a man leaves when something's sitting wrong with him that he doesn't care to explain." "You think he knows something?" "I think a man doesn't leave good, steady work over nothing." She was quiet a long while, the wind pulling a loose curl across her face, and when she spoke again her voice had gone thin with something between fear and resolve. "If you go asking him," she said, "you understand there may be an answer neither of us wants." "I understand that." He met her eyes steady. "But I don't think you're the kind of woman who'd rather keep an easy lie than know a hard truth. And I don't much want to be the kind of man who lets a woman go on doubting alone when there's a question that could be answered plain." She studied him a moment longer, and something in her face loosened just slightly, like a knot given an inch of slack. "Then go ask him," she said. "And Mr. Coye, thank you for not telling me I was imagining things most men would have." He found Owen Praxton 3 days later, in the shade of a lined shack with the peaks rising sharp and clean behind him, and the man's uneasy manner told Nathaniel plainly, before a single word was spoken, that there was something here worth the asking. "Wasn't my place to question the coroner," Owen said, turning his hat slow in his hands. "But I'll tell you what I told the sheriff back then for whatever it's worth to you now. The cinch strap on Mr. Kirkland's saddle was cut clean through when I found him, not frayed, not worn thin the way leather goes bad over years, a clean cut, the kind a blade makes on purpose." "You told the sheriff that?" "I did. He said saddle leather wears strange sometimes, ruled it consistent enough with an accidental fall regardless." Owen's jaw tightened. "But Warren Kirkland was standing right there when the sheriff made his ruling, agreeing with every word of it. And I was 3 weeks from losing my position either way, whatever I said. Wasn't in much of a position to argue with two men who both wanted the same simple answer." Nathaniel rode back toward Copper Hollow with considerably more weighing on him than he'd carried out that morning, the light going long and gold across the valley floor, understanding plainly that whatever he'd started asking about was no longer a curiosity he could set aside once satisfied. If a story like this one has found some quiet place in your evening, a like helps it find the next person who needs a little company too. And if you're carrying doubts of your own tonight about a truth you've been too tired to chase, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. He told Addie that same evening, sitting across from her at the small table in the cabin, the last color of sunset filling the window behind her, neither of them reaching yet for a lamp. "A cut strap," she repeated, her voice gone very quiet. "You're telling me someone did this on purpose, that he didn't simply fall?" "I'm telling you what a hired hand saw and was too afraid to insist on 8 months ago," Nathaniel said carefully. "I'm not telling you I know who or why. I'm telling you because you asked the same question yourself about that horse walking home too calm, and I think you deserve to know you weren't imagining a reason to doubt what everyone else found so easy to accept." Addie sat with that a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the table as though steadying herself against something physical. "Warren came to see me 2 days ago," she said finally, "wanting me to sign the cabin and the land over to him quietly, before the court rules. Dressed it up kind, called it a mercy toward his brother's widow. But there was something underneath it, Nathaniel. Some urgency that didn't match a man, simply waiting on the law to run its course." "You think he's connected to this?" "I don't want to think it." She pressed her fingers briefly to her closed eyes. "He's Thomas's own brother. Whatever bitterness sat between them, that's still—" She stopped, unable to finish it. "You don't have to decide what it means tonight," Nathaniel said, "but I don't believe you can unknow it now either." They sat together as the last light left the window, the mountains fading from purple into full black, and Addie found some measure of comfort simply in not having to hold the weight of it alone, not yet knowing that the answer waiting at the bottom of it all was closer, and far uglier, than either of them yet understood. 2 days passed with the question hanging over them both, unanswered and heavy, before Nathaniel arrived at the cabin without any news at all, only a string of trout he'd caught that morning in the creek running through his own leased land. "Didn't come with anything to report," he said, holding it up somewhat sheepish. "Just figured a body's got to eat regardless of what's hanging over her, and I make a fair trout when the mood strikes me." Addie looked at the fish, then at him, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in days. "That may be the kindest thing you've brought me yet," she said, "wildflowers and firewood included." They cooked it together in the narrow kitchen, working around each other with an ease that surprised them both. Nathaniel taught her, without quite meaning to turn it into a lesson, the particular trick his own mother had used for crisping the skin properly, and Addie laughed, genuinely laughed, for what felt like the first time in 8 months, when he singed his own sleeve reaching too close to the flame. "Some rancher you are," she said, fanning smoke away from his arm. "Can't even fry a fish without setting yourself alight." "In my defense," Nathaniel said, entirely unbothered, "the fish came out perfect." They ate on the porch as the light went long and gold across the valley, talking of nothing consequential at all. A calf he'd lost the patience to name. A hymn Addie hadn't sung since she was a girl in Cheyenne, but still remembered every word of. The particular way the mountains changed color depending on the hour. And Addie found herself watching him in the last of that evening light, thinking less about cut straps and contested land than she had in a week, grateful simply for one ordinary supper that belonged to nothing but the two of them. It was Addie herself who insisted, a few days later, on riding out to Widow's Notch, wanting to see the place with her own eyes for the first time since the funeral. The trail climbed steady through stands of aspen, already going gold at the edges with autumn's early turn, the air thin and sharp in a way that seemed to cut the color of everything around them more clean. The deep green of the pines, the last white glare of snow clinging to the highest ridges, the impossible blue of a sky unmarked by anything but a few high threads of cloud. The notch itself was a strange kind of beautiful, which struck Addie as its own particular cruelty. A narrow rock gorge where a mountain stream had worn its bed smooth over centuries, wildflowers still clinging stubborn to the wet soil at its edges, columbine and aster scattered purple and white against gray stone. The kind of view that drew painters some seasons from as far as Cheyenne, entirely indifferent to the fact that it had also, 8 months before, been the last thing her husband ever saw. He rode this trail 100 times, Addie said, standing at the edge where the drop began, the whole valley spread below them in every direction. Knew every turn of it since he was a boy. I've never once believed a horse could spook bad enough here on ground this familiar to actually throw him. Nathaniel stood close beside her, his eyes moving over the terrain with the same careful attention he brought to reading weather or judging cattle. Trail's wide enough here, he said. Footing's solid too. A man would need considerably worse ground than this to get thrown, unless something else was working against him besides a spooked animal. She looked at him a long moment, the wind pulling at her loose curls. I don't know how to thank you for taking this seriously, she said. Most men would have let a widow's questions about a cut strap go unanswered rather than risk the trouble of asking them properly. Wasn't much of a choice once I heard it plain, Nathaniel said. A man doesn't get to call himself decent while walking right past an injustice he's capable of looking into. They brought Owen Praxton's account to Sheriff Dale Emmett the following week, along with Nathaniel's own careful notes comparing the description of the cut strap to the ordinary, where he'd studied on a dozen saddles since first hearing the story, and watched the sheriff's expression shift slow from polite skepticism into real unease as the pieces settled into place in front of him. I ruled that an accident 8 months back, Emmett admitted, on evidence that seemed sufficient at the time and on the word of a family member standing right there agreeing with the ruling. He looked at Addie directly. I owe you a more thorough look than I gave this the first time, Mrs. Kirkland. That much is plain to me now. Warren was summoned to the sheriff's office 2 days later, and Nathaniel watched the man's composure crack in small, telling increments as Emmett laid out plainly what Owen Praxton had witnessed and never been properly asked to explain. I don't know a thing about any cut strap, Warren said, though his voice carried a tightness that hadn't been there the week before, standing in Addie's own yard, dressing his demands up as kindness. Boy's mistaken or lying or looking to stir trouble for a family that let him go without much ceremony. He wasn't let go for cause, Emmett said. Your own foreman's records show he left on his own account and hasn't worked Kirkland land since the week your brother died. Seems an odd coincidence for a man supposedly lying with no reason to. Coincidence is all it is, Warren said, though the color had gone from his face entirely. There's also the matter, Emmett continued, of a survey request filed with the Territorial Land Office 3 months before your brother's death. Mineral assessment on the exact section of Kirkland land bordering Widow's Notch. Filed under your name, Warren, not Thomas's. Care to explain what you were assessing on land you didn't yet legally control? If you're the kind who likes puzzling out the truth right alongside the story, tell me in the comments. Did you already suspect what Warren was hiding? Or did that land survey catch you as off guard as it caught Addie? Silence stretched long in that small office, and it was in that silence, watching something break loose behind Warren Kirkland's eyes, that Nathaniel understood plainly they had finally arrived at the true shape of what had happened at Widow's Notch. A truth uglier and more deliberate than either of them had let themselves imagine, even after everything they'd already uncovered. You'd best sit down, Mr. Kirkland, Emmett said quietly, sliding a chair toward him. I expect we're only just now getting to the part that matters. Warren didn't sit. He stood there a long moment, hands opening and closing at his sides, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the easy confidence he'd carried into Addie's yard days before. "You don't understand what that land is sitting on," he said. "None of you understand what I was trying to protect." Addie felt something cold settle low in her chest, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would change the shape of Thomas's death permanently. Past any comfortable version of it, she might still have been holding onto without quite admitting it to herself. She reached without thinking for Nathaniel's hand, and he took it steady, saying nothing, simply present, the same quiet way he'd offered himself from that very first morning at the washtub. Whatever Warren said next, she understood, there would be no going back from it. Only forward, into whatever truth had been waiting 8 months at the bottom of Widow's Notch for someone brave enough to finally go looking for it. "Silver," Warren said finally, the word dropping into that small office like a stone into still water. "There's silver under that section of ground bordering the notch. A prospector passing through last year told me plain, showed me proof enough to know he wasn't spinning tales. The kind of vein that makes a man's fortune overnight, same as it's done in half the mining camps scattered across this territory." Addie felt the words land somewhere deep and cold. "You knew," she said. "All this time you knew, and you let me believe this was only ever about spite and old land grievances between brothers." "I filed the survey quiet under my own name," Warren went on, not quite looking at either of them now, his eyes fixed instead on some middle distance neither of them could see. "Didn't want to risk word reaching Thomas before I'd found some way to claim the section for myself. Spent months after that hunting for a legal path around him. That old statute was meant to be my second plan, only if he learned of the silver and needed maneuvering out of clear ownership through the courts instead. And when legal means took too long," Sheriff Emmett said quietly, "you found a faster one." Warren's hands opened and closed at his sides. A second party was making inquiries about that same ground. I didn't have time left to wait on courts and statutes. I told myself I only meant to slow him down. Cut the strap thin enough it should have failed gradual, thrown him somewhere safe, given me time to argue him out of the land while he mended from a bad fall. His voice cracked on the next words, the first real break in 8 months of careful denial. I didn't account for which stretch of trail he'd be riding when it finally gave. Didn't account for how steep that particular bend was. Told myself after it was still an accident, regardless. That I hadn't meant the ravine specifically. Only meant to slow him. "You still cut the strap," Emmett said, flat and final. "Whatever you meant by it, you made the choice that killed him." Warren said nothing more. And Addie, standing in the doorway of that small office with 8 months of grief and doubt, and cautious hope all colliding at once inside her, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of it. Not triumph. Not even quite relief. Something closer to an exhausted, sorrowful clarity, the truth finally settling into a shape she could grieve honestly, instead of simply surviving around the edges of it. She wept properly for the first time in 8 months that evening, sitting on the cabin porch with the mountains going dark and stars scattering slow above the valley, Nathaniel beside her, saying nothing at all, simply present, the same steady way he'd offered himself from that very first morning at the washtub. "I couldn't grieve him honestly before," she said once the worst of it had passed. "Not truly. I was too busy surviving. The laundry, the legal fight, Warren's constant pressure. I never let myself sit with the actual loss of him. The real Thomas, not the mystery of his dying, the man who taught me to read weather off these mountains, who never once made me feel foolish for not knowing ranch work when we married." "Grief needs room to happen," Nathaniel said. "Hard to give it that room when you're fighting a legal battle and a killer's brother all at once, same time you're supposed to be mourning." "I have room now," Addie said. "Strange as that sounds after a day like today, the truth is terrible, but it's mine properly, instead of a doubt I was too afraid to examine." She looked at him in the starlight. "You gave me that, the room to ask the question instead of only surviving the not knowing. Didn't give you anything you didn't already have the courage to start asking yourself," Nathaniel said. "Just helped carry some of the weight of asking it out loud." The territorial court resolved Addie's inheritance within a month of Warren's confession. The obscure statute he'd weaponized against her rendered entirely irrelevant by his own conviction. The Kirkland ranch, and its newly discovered mineral wealth, settled fully and legally into her name without further contest from any surviving family. She found herself that autumn the owner of land worth more than she'd ever imagined during 6 years of marriage to Thomas, and discovered, working through the practical business of it all with the mining company's careful lawyers, a genuine talent for negotiation her old Cheyenne upbringing had never prepared her for, insisting on fair wages and safety terms for any miners who'd eventually work the claim. Nathaniel watched her navigate that transformation with the same quiet attention he'd once brought to watching her at the wash tub, and found himself, more than once, examining his own feelings honestly toward a woman who'd gone within a single season from a struggling widow to one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory. He rode past her fence 3 mornings that first week without stopping at all, turning the matter over privately, half convinced that whatever he felt for her now would look, from the outside, exactly like a poor rancher chasing a fortune he'd had no claim to when he'd first started splitting her firewood. "You've gone quiet on me," Addie observed one evening, finally catching him at the fence again, the two of them walking the pasture line as the sky went violet behind the peaks. "I'd like to know why, if you're willing to say it plainly." "Nearly didn't come by at all this week," Nathaniel admitted. "Kept thinking how it'd look, courting a woman with a silver fortune, when I've got a leased parcel and a herd small enough to count twice before breakfast. Didn't want to be the kind of man who only finds his nerve once there's something worth finding it for." "You found your nerve 8 months before anyone knew there was silver under this ground," Addie said. "I watched you find it morning after morning at a washtub that had nothing to offer you but a woman's tired hands and a lost cause of a legal fight. I don't think a fortune erases that. If anything, it only means I finally have the freedom to choose you without survival forcing my hand at all. I'd rather you trusted that freedom than doubted it into silence." He asked her properly a week later, at the very fence line where he'd first stopped his horse 3 mornings running. The wildflowers he'd once brought her now grown thick and wild along the pasture edge of their own accord. "Never did give you that fresh start I promised at the washtub," he said. "Not properly. Circumstances got considerably more complicated than either of us expected that morning." "You gave me more than a fresh start," Addie said. "You gave me the truth about my husband's death and the courage to grieve him honestly, and 8 months of steady, patient decency I'd stopped believing men were capable of offering without wanting something back." "Then let me finish what I started," Nathaniel said, and knelt beside the fence where the whole of it had first taken root. "Marry me, Addie Kirkland. Not because either of us needs rescuing anymore. You've land and fortune enough now to need rescuing from nothing at all. Because I've spent 8 months falling in love with a woman capable of surviving betrayal and grief and injustice with her dignity fully intact. And I don't much want to spend whatever years I've got left wondering what it would have felt like to keep riding past that fence instead of finally asking properly." Addie knelt in the wildflowers beside him, taking his weathered hands in both of hers. "Yes," she said, simple and complete. "1,000 times yes." They married that winter in the same small church that had once filled past capacity for Thomas Kirkland's funeral, the mountain peaks visible through its tall windows dressed in full white, snow falling soft outside as the ceremony proceeded, the whole valley hushed and gleaming under a covering that made even the most familiar landmarks look newly made. Addie kept in a small box on her writing desk for the rest of her life the torn scrap of cinch leather Owen Praxton had preserved all those months, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. She told her own children years later that the truth was always worth pursuing, even when the comfortable lie would have been so much easier to simply accept and carry instead. The mountains stood above Copper Hollow the same as they always had, indifferent and magnificent, regardless of whatever grief or joy played out in their shadow. And Addie found, in the years that followed, that she'd finally learned to love the view from Widow's Notch again, not despite what had happened there, but because she'd earned the right, at last, to know the whole truth of it, and to build something new in its aftermath. If Addie and Nathaniel's evening stayed with you tonight, subscribe for more stories where truth and quiet courage meet on the frontier, and I'll see you at the next fence line.